What up? This your boy Cass with Taboo Topics. Topics to get you thinking, might even get you to drinking. So today we're going to talk about the Minnesota shooting that happened a couple of weeks ago. Tragic loss of life. Miss Renee Good, who was tragically killed by the hands of a Mr. Jonathan Ross. This is a crazy story. You know, if you guys have not seen it already, of course I invite you to go check it out. It's not for the faint at heart. You know, obviously it is. You know, it's graphic by nature. You know, but not by fault in terms of Miss Good and the Good family. You know, if you have children, I recommend you don't, expose that to them. You know, you make sure it's not on a television or anything like that. That you got your phone or your tablet or something like that to protect the young minds. Of course, we love the young people. So, in terms of this story, right? So, I with all the the opinions that are going around about this story, I kind of went back and looked at it a couple of times, the video the other day, and I've got it somewhat of a different take on it now. Now, don't get me wrong, of course, I am a little frustrated. I think the whole country is frustrated for different reasons. But when I saw that video and I could see Miss Renee's wife, Becca, outside of that car, and she was having a back and forth with Mr. Ross, I said, that seems a bit antagonizing. Should she have had a right to speak her mind? Of course. Freedom of speech? Of course. That's the country we live in. We live in a country where we believe that we should be able to hold that dear, and we should be able to take advantage of it when we feel necessary, and that we should be heard. We shouldn't feel like we're in a place where our freedom of speech can bring on tragedy like loss of life, and disruption of family and things like that. But in terms of what happened that day, freedom of speech cost someone their lives. Sadly, when I think about that, we're in a country now where it's starting to feel like it's a common thing for loss of life to be taken based around the things that we consider, laws and foundations put in place by the founding fathers and things like that. Like those things are coming back to now bite us in the what, right? No loss of life should have happened that day. Nothing like that should have taken place, right? We can see in that video that Becca was having a back and forth with Mr. Jonathan, Mr. Ross, right? And in that back and forth, we can see her making statements, which, again, some people may consider somewhat antagonizing. But at the same time, some people may say, well, how is it antagonizing if it's freedom of speech and no laws are broken? I agree. That's totally true. The issue with it, though, that I found is that, these guys, these ICE agents, they're emboldened. They feel like they're in a place of high power and authority and position. And I imagine that when they were given this authority, they were already hungry for this sense of power. So they're already worked up, right? They're already, emotional, right? So, I imagine that when they were having that back and forth, that it got to his head. Who are you to speak your mind to me? Who are you to feel that your freedom of speech gives you the authority to speak to me? And I can see that. I can see that Mr. Jonathan thought that, right? And backtracking a little bit. So this particular day in Minnesota, ICE agents were pretty heavy in numbers. They were more than likely going to conduct some of their what they would call to be legal raids, which is another discussion. They're coming to do their business, for lack of terms. And, obviously, Renee and Becca are from this area or familiar with this area, at least. And they felt, hey, you know what? This isn't right. We don't agree with what's going on with this. Let's let our voices be heard. Let's do what other Americans are doing to stand up for what we believe is right and allow our freedom of speech to be a presence, right? So in the process of this, the car that Miss Good, both Mrs. Goods were riding in, they decided to cause a blockade, right? Preventing the agents from proceeding into their town or passing. And in this same video, we can see the ICE agents come to a halt, stopping their cars and getting out of these vehicles. And we can see an agent approach Miss Renee's vehicle as she sat in the driver's seat with the car still running and having a discussion with this agent, whom was not Mr. Ross. She was pleasant, very pleasant, friendly and understanding, non-aggressive whatsoever. And you can see she's mentioning to him, hey, I'm just conducting traffic. I have no issues with you. I have no issues with you personally. We're just directing traffic. And we can see her doing that. Now, this agent, on the other hand, we can see that he was totally ignoring her. He was totally, disregarding her statements. We can see that. And we can see that in the process of her having that discussion with him, we can see Mr. Ross coming from a different vehicle, approaching the vehicle that they were sitting in. And we can see Becca coming around and starting this discussion that, we're focusing on. And we can hear Becca in the background stating, go have lunch, go about your business and we'll see you later because we're going to be here, right? That was her energy. Was that aggressive? I don't think that was aggressive, in all fairness and respect to Miss Good. But I do think that was antagonizing. I do think that, or at least, let me rephrase that. I do think the agent took it as antagonizing. Because to us on the outside, it's freedom of speech, right? Here's where I saw that, though. Here's what I believe is tricky about that, though. I don't think that they considered the danger that they were putting themselves in, right? Because these agents are emboldened. They're angry. They have a sense of entitlement, if that makes sense, right? And I think as she's having this discussion, this small back and forth with him, it hadn't quite registered, what she was really bringing on herself. Because you can hear them in the background being aggressive verbally and different things like that. And then fast forward in that video, we can see Becca walking around the vehicle. Still in the discussion, we can see Mr. Ross following her around his vehicle. And in the process of that, we can see Renee having a discussion with the other agent, friendly, pleasant, as we just stated. And then he begins to aggressively demand that she step out of the vehicle. And then, and that point, as he approaches the vehicle, he appears to be getting ready to try to pull her out of the car. And then you can see Miss Renee mood change. You can see her demeanor change. She appeared to be afraid all of a sudden, as though she feared she was in danger. And in the process of that, you can see her throw the car in reverse. Then you can see her throw the car into drive. And at that point, we can see Mr. Ross making his way around the vehicle, whom Miss Renee did not see him. If we really look at that video and definitely being fair, she did not see Mr. Ross. She didn't see him in front of that vehicle, which tells me she had no intentions on running this man over or killing this man. But according to him, based on his energy in the situation, he's like, I'm in danger now. I have a reason now to take action. And this man takes his pew-pew out in pew-pews, ending Miss Renee's life in such a tragic way. And then we can hear little statements after the fact, that of course, YouTube won't allow me to say, but disrespectful statements after this woman lost her life. It's very sad, very sad, I imagine that Becca is dealing with some sense of remorse in terms of blame, right? Like, did I cause that? Is she seeing it the way that I'm beginning to see it now? And is she struggling with that? Did I handle this situation that caused the life of my mate, my loved one? Is it my fault? That's a lifelong sense of trauma that she's now going to have to suffer through. And if we're pointing the fingers, we have to point the fingers at who in terms of the root cause of this. Because if we look at the root cause and then we can say who's truly at fault, neither of the Goods are at fault for this situation. I'm just merely stating that preemptive thinking was not a part of Mrs. Becca, I should say, thinking at the moment. that she didn't really see what was coming. And of course, no one expects that tragedy to happen if they're doing what they feel is their civil right or civil duty, which is freedom of speech, right? But I imagine that she's really suffering through that, and I imagine that she's trying to deal with that while also dealing with the idea that she's got to plan a funeral. She's got to be there for loved ones. She's got to help make sense of it, not just for herself but others. That's deep. That's so deep, and I just couldn't imagine being in that position. We're getting to a place again in this country where freedom of speech is becoming not so free. I think that's wrong. How did we get to this place? Some may argue that we've always been in this position, but there used to be a time where if you had an opinion and you could voice it, you could walk away safely. But that's no longer the case. No one should have lost their lives. Loss of life should not have taken place that day. And if we're talking about the person in the White House, that's another conversation. For a different time, I can go on and on for days about that. But in terms of this, was it antagonizing? Was it perceived as antagonizing? I believe in the eyes of the agent, it was antagonizing. As I look deeper into the situation, I so wish that Becca would have preemptively saw the situation a little clearer and understood who she was dealing with. Because I feel so, so deep for her and her family now, because now they have to deal with the tragedy that took place. The children have to deal with a tragedy that took place. And how do you explain that to the children? How do you explain to the children that your mother was only speaking her First Amendment right and it cost her life? It shouldn't be a country that becomes the norm in. It shouldn't be normal. Things have to change in some form or fashion. But again, at the topic at hand, was it antagonizing and would life have been lost? I don't think so. If I'm being fair, I don't think so. I think things would have turned out differently. Not to say that things won't continue to happen though, because as we know, as of late, a shooting has taken place and another person has lost their life. And then we may ask, is there anything that's going to happen in the process of these tragedies, right? Not anytime soon. If I'm being honest, not anytime soon. I don't believe that. I think they are taking full advantage of their authority. And their authority has put them in a position where now that tragedies have happened, not to say their authority has put them in a position, but their emboldenedness has put them in a position to where now it's like, look what I can get away with. It's wrong. It's wrong, guys. But let me know what you guys think. How do you feel about that? Could she have avoided this situation? Did she understand? Did Becca understand the position that they were in? And is that going to get the attention of Americans moving forward? Are we going to readapt our way of thinking? Are we going to readapt our way of thinking towards those in authority? Are we going to become a country over the next few years of bowing down to the abnormal just to protect our lives, just to feel safe? Are we going to be afraid to speak freedom of free speech, in terms of what's in our hearts and what's right? Let me know what you think. Taboo Talks with your boy Kaz.